to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello everyone, it's so good to be back with you. Welcome to Season 6 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Dr. Kristy Goodwin is an award-winning researcher and speaker. In her book, Dear Digital, We Need to Talk, she shares realistic, research-based micro-habits that people can apply to tame their digital habits and thrive in the digital world. As one of Australia's digital well-being and productivity experts, she shares practical, brain-based hacks to tame tech habits and the latest evidence-based strategies to decode the neurobiology of peak performance in the technological era. Hello, Kristy, and welcome to Raising Teens.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Kristy, you have just released your second book, and I know we'll get into that a little bit today, but you've been working with schools and families and advising principals, teachers, parents for a very long time now. And your work is and always has been about helping people live with technology in healthy ways. I think back to those early days where everybody was terrified about technology and it was something evil and terrible, and you really were very positive about it, but also talking to us in very realistic ways about healthy habits. But I'm thinking, what are some of the biggest changes, both good and not so good, that you have seen around the effects of technology on families in, say, the last 10 years?
Yes, and what a lovely compliment, Collett. I really do hope that I present that it's not all doom and gloom, and I'm very realistic. I completely agree. There are some potential pitfalls, dangers, and harms associated with the online world, and it would be naive to suggest otherwise. But I also think that banning technology completely, demonizing it, or telling our kids that it's bad for them won't actually serve them, because as adults, whether we love it or loathe it, the harsh reality is it's here to stay. It plays a pivotal role in our young people's lives. It's a significant tool in their learning now. We know it's their conduit for connection with their peer groups. It is their avenue for consumption of information. It's how they spend a lot of their leisure time. So I think that digital amputation is not the solution. We often know with adolescents in general, anytime we tell them that something is forbidden, it becomes the forbidden fruit. And what we end up doing is driving the behavior underground and almost making them want it even more and more. So I think what we have to do as parents, educators, caregivers, health professionals in this space is that we have to arm our young people with science-backed information about how they can use technology, but do so in a way that will help them rather than harm them. So in relation to what I've seen change in the last 10 years, obviously the rate of adoption of new technologies has just been exponential. We have something called the digital penetration rate, and that describes how many years it typically takes a digital technology to penetrate to 50 million global users. So if you can remember dial-up internet, the dial-up internet, believe it or not, took around 13 years until 50 million people adopted it. Facebook took 4 years to hit penetration rate. YouTube took 2 years. Angry Birds took 35 days. Pokemon Go, do you remember when everybody was walking around trying to catch these virtual creatures? Yes, 1 to 2 days to hit penetration rate. The death by suicide that was streamed on a social media platform a couple of years ago and then repurposed and spliced into a whole lot of content specifically directed and consumed not only by teens but also by children, it is estimated that that took a couple of hours to reach penetration rate. So the technology is growing and changing at such rapid rates. And I think that's the common denominator that I've seen in the last 10 years. The technology and the platforms have certainly changed, but the one consistent denominator is that it's changing rapidly. So for parents and caregivers and educators, this makes it really challenging, because when we finally wrap our head around what on earth TikTok or Snapchat or Discord or whatever the new platform is that they're, infatuated with, I guarantee along will come something else to supersede it. And so I think that is the real challenge for parents and educators. We feel like we're constantly on the back foot. The other thing that I think is changing and that I have seen having a real impact, there's three aspects of adolescence, I think, that have really significantly been shaped by technology, whether it be that multiplayer video games, social media, smartphone usage. If I was to cluster the three changes I see, I think we're seeing changes in relationships, interpersonal, how adolescents want to connect. They don't ever, if your teen rings you, it must be a really serious issue. What is their first preference? Text message, DM, a snap. So the way that they connect and relate, I'm also going to challenge that I think it is adults' usage and our digital dependence as adults. And I know many of us justify it under the guise of work or relying on it. But I think in terms of relationships, we're missing those micro moments of connection with our young people. When your teenager finally picks up their towel and hangs it up in the bathroom, when they do something loving and kind to one of their siblings, when they unpack the dishwasher without being asked, the wink or the nudge or the high five, like just those little moments of bonding. So I think our relationships are changing. The other thing that I know is particularly impacting our adolescents is that their digital habits and behaviours are having a really profound impact on their sleep. Not only just how much sleep they're getting, but also the quality of their sleep. We know that the blue light exposure is having a really profound impact on the structure, the architecture of their sleep. And the third area is, I think, because they are spending so much time online, again, for learning and leisure. We're always quick to point the finger and assume that they're spending a lot of their time for leisure pursuits, and there's no doubt they are. But we also have to acknowledge that that's coupled with the fact that schools now, most of them, you require some sort of digital device on the stationery list.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my high school son, who's my youngest, spends every day doing homework with his laptop, compared to my eldest, who's out of school. He wasn't doing that at this age. There is a really big change even within one generation, I think, and that really talks to that digital penetration you were talking about now. Also, we hear a lot of sweeping comments about the negative effects of phones, social media, online games, all those things you spoke about, particularly around young people's mental health. We hear these things like, our young people are more depressed, struggling with their anxiety more, which we know they are, but it's because of technology. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, it is very satisfying, may I say, simple narrative to point the finger exclusively and say it has to be social media and smartphone use that's causing this mental health issue. And yes, there is certainly ample research that shows there is a strong correlation between social media use, smartphone use, even gaming use, and poorer mental health outcomes. But correlation does not prove causation. And the harsh reality is, as a researcher, I know how challenging, I might even say the word impossible it is to get ethics approval to do an experimental study where you have a randomized control group and there is some potential risk of harm. We just will not get the ethics approval. And so, to be honest, there's a real paucity in the research in terms of experimental randomized control studies. The other thing that I want to point out is that of the available studies that we do have, yes, there is some suggestion that there could perhaps be a causal effect. We are seeing some evidence that's suggesting it's more pronounced for females than males. But again, we don't have a big enough research body, I don't think, a big enough corpus of research to draw strong findings and strong conclusions from that. The other issue that I have is that a lot of the studies that have been conducted, what they're doing is looking at symptoms. So symptoms of mental health issues, so symptoms of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation at the diagnosis, because we know to do a clinical diagnosis to identify these mental health issues would make the research, so much more cumbersome. And so the problem with self-reporting or looking just at symptoms doesn't necessarily mean they have diagnosable mental health issues. So I think there's some gaps in the research. I'm not naive, though. I think it would be ill-placed of me to suggest that, social media is not having an impact at all. I think that it is certainly having an impact, but I think it's having an impact in a non-direct way. And what I mean is that social media or whatever digital usage they're having, I think it's the displacement effect that explains why we're seeing a decline in mental health. And it's the three issues I mentioned before: relationships, sleep, and physical movement. We know are absolute pillars of psychological and physical well-being. And if their time online is eroding, displacing, superseding those basic needs, I think this is why we're seeing the decline in mental health, not necessarily, or perhaps coupled with, their use of social media. And that face-to-face social interaction is so important. We know that that's why lockdown was so challenging for so many of us, because when we are with real people, real humans in real time, our brain produces oxytocin. It's the social bonding love hormone. Studies have compared what happens when we connect in real time with real people versus text-based communication. What these studies tell us time and time again is that text-based communication does not reduce cortisol, that stress hormone, but in-person connection will. We also know that we don't make as much oxytocin, that social bonding hormone, on text-based communication. So it doesn't mean that we say we shouldn't text your friends. We should, but it's no replacement for in-person human connection.
Yeah. So then, on that vein, do you have any thoughts on this push to have phones out of sight or banned during a high schooler's day?
Look, this is such a controversial issue.
Yes.
And I fall back on research, because then I don't have to get stuck in a philosophical debate. What I know from the available research, and again, we don't have a huge amount, a lot of the studies that are available have been conducted internationally, not here in Australia or in this sort of similar New Zealand context. The research findings are very mixed. Some of the earlier studies basically said that it often drove the behaviour underground and it became a forbidden fruit. So whilst we would have a ban, what the students would pop a phone in a pouch or have it locked in a designated spot, what happens is that they pull out another one from their phone, or students in some schools, I know where they really enforced the bans, they started communicating, texting on a Google Doc or another online platform.
You may be aware that mobile phones will be banned in New South Wales public high school classrooms, recess, and lunchtimes from term 4 this year. They're already banned in other states and in other places around the world. The government cited better test results, reduced incidents of bullying, and increased social interaction as some of the reasons behind the change. However, this change will not be perfect for everyone. As a parent, I know how different each of my 3 children are and how the boundaries and conversations have been different with each of them. If you listen to Season 6, Episode 4 on ADHD, you will know that I have family with ADHD, and so that makes some of these conversations even more complex. In COVID, you might have noticed how difficult it was to help your teens keep on top of their schoolwork and their tech habits. Can you imagine what it is like for a teacher who has a different set of 25 to 30 kids in their classroom every 45 minutes? It's a complex issue, and schools have a duty of care to support their amazing teachers and their students, both those who may be able to handle more autonomy and those who may need more structure. Also, consider how passionate your own child can get when their friends are doing something that they really want to do, and then you can get an idea of what the teachers are dealing with in the classroom and on the playground.
The research shows that there is some reduction in incidents of bullying, and there have been some studies that shown that, and they were statistically significant, improvements in academic outcomes. But then we need to look at students in disadvantaged areas who may not have another digital device. So a phone is their conduit for learning. My real concern, and the interesting point I have here, is that I do a lot of work in the corporate world as well, and employers are telling me they are struggling to recruit people with the skill of focused attention. Young students who they're headhunting with fine academic transcripts out of university enter the workplace and all of a sudden there's no pouch to pop your phone in or there's no box to pop your phone in. These are skills that are not learned by osmosis. These are skills that young people need to cultivate. So what I think the best position is that schools certainly have to have what I call tech expectations. We have to communicate, and I think we have to build an agreement or a policy with young people involvement. I've worked with several schools where it's actually the students, supported by the teachers and parents, but it's often the students saying, I am so distracted by my phone that I would like some parameters put in place during the school day. But I don't think that a blanket ban or a ban without student consultation or voice will work. I think we really do need some parameters, though. I think because kids know they find it really hard to resist the lure. So I think some guidance or guardrails, I often use that term, would be really helpful rather than just a blanket ban, because we want our kids to cultivate these skills. And again, it seems like a simple solution. And I understand from a parent's perspective, it would seem like such a pragmatic thing to say, we'll just ban them from it. But we know in many schools that's not working. And again, we need to equip them with these skills, and these skills are learned through experience and some tight, loving parameters around that. So I think that's the approach.
On that theme of, adults talking to young people, and you spoke about it in the beginning, how often as adults we are consumed by our own phones and we're missing opportunities to connect with our own children because we always legitimize, it's important because it's a work email, or, it's grandma, or it's more important or more legitimate than what we think our teens are doing on their phones or online. And a common theme I often talk with my guests about is modeling behaviors with our young people and modeling healthy choices. And in this context, behaviors with our technology. It's more the do what I do rather than do what I say. That's the kind of parenting I think that most of my experts talk about. And in your new book, Dear Digital, We Need to Talk, I love that title of your book. It's a fantastic example of us as adults working on our own digital habits. So tell me first, why did you write this book, Kristy?
To be honest, I wrote this book because I didn't have a handle on my digital habits. Even though this is what I research, this is what I speak about, I became a slave to my screen. And I really wanted to understand. I had an awful incident with my middle son who had a very substantial injury at a time when I was digitally distracted. He was climbing on a lounge, fell face first, while I was trying to triage a bulging inbox. And required urgent hospitalisation, and still to this day has a very prominent scar on his lip as a very tangible reminder of what could have otherwise been, a really dire outcome for him. And so I think for years I'd been speaking about kids and teens, or what they're often referred to as screenagers. Why were our young people addicted and digitally dependent and distracted? And it really hit me that we're not that much better. As you said, we often justify our use in terms of work or using it in a functional way. And I do acknowledge, as a parent myself, I certainly do use it in that way. But we're also using it as a recreational, a leisure tool, a conduit for connection. And so I wrote the book after that accident with my son, Billy. I started to look into what is it about the online world that lures us in? What is it that draws us, sucks us into that digital vortex as adults? And looked at the neuroscience and psychology behind our digital habits and behaviors. I completely agree that we need to be good digital role models. I also acknowledge how hard that can be. And so I think we need to be good digital role models because the developing brain, or the human brain, I should say, has mirror neurons. And mirror neurons mean we are biologically designed as humans to imitate and copy. That's how we develop language. That's how we develop our motor skills. So you can tell your kids and teens to put down their phone or stop, being tethered to technology. But if you're not walking the talk, it's really hard for them to emulate that. And in the book, I share with permission a story that a mum shared with me, how she went to pick her daughter up from school one day, and her daughter very innocently and after school care said to her mum, "How much do you earn per hour?" And her mum thought her daughter was finally ambitious and said, "Look, sweetheart, I earn a salary, but I'd need to do some calculations. I'll get back to you." And she tucked her daughter into bed that night. She said, "Sweetheart, I've calculated my hourly rate. This is what it is. And why do you ask?" And her daughter turned and said to her mum, "Because I'd like to buy an hour of your time without your phone."
I was reminded of this recently when I was having a conversation with my teenager while reading a news article on my phone. he was the one who came off worst. As he walked away, I suddenly realized I'd hardly heard anything he'd said. I had to apologize, and I challenged myself again to put my phone down when my children are talking to me. It's something I think we have to keep modeling and keep working on. That's not to say you wouldn't set a time to do work or watch a movie or ask your children not to interrupt you for an hour. I know I have, but in the same way, we need to grant our children the same rule. For example, when you've allowed for an hour on the PlayStation or their phone, don't interrupt them or expect instant compliance to come and do chores in the middle of the game. By allowing each other freedom without interruptions and also not having conversations on autopilot shows that you value each other's time.
Our kids and teens are seeing this. And, we can bury our head in the sand. We can try and legitimize it under the guise of work. But the harsh reality is that tech, all the tech that we use, even as adults, our professional tech and our personal tech, has been deliberately designed, engineered and manipulated, I believe, to rob us of our two most important resources, our time and attention. And if you haven't read Johann Hari's Stolen Focus, can I implore you, it is a great book that really talks about some of the persuasive mechanics that are built into technology that have been engineered to rob us of our attention and our time.
Yeah, wow. In some of your research in this book, you talk about the changes that happened around the pandemic in the way we began to work or do schooling. Talk us a little bit through what you say in your book.
So our digital load increased exponentially during the pandemic. I don't know many people where that wasn't the case. I know in our family, our screen time rules and or parameters, certainly the bar was most certainly lowered during the pandemic. Yes, research tells us that the average adult during the height of lockdowns, the average adult was spending 13.28 hours a day on their various screens. Now, some of that would have been perhaps for work purposes. That is an average. That is with adults. I don't have any research that I'm aware of that actually quantified adolescent or children's use, but I dare say it would be very similar, perhaps even higher than that. And so what we're seeing now in many instances is that those rules and sort of digital parameters or guardrails were adjusted during the pandemic and lockdown. And out of necessity, I will point out, I acknowledge how challenging a time this was. But the problem that we're now seeing today is that many schools, parents, community groups are saying they're seeing what I colloquially refer to as the digital hangover. The tech habits and behaviours that sort of crept in and that we perhaps allowed during the pandemic that have continued. And so kids are spending disproportionate amounts of time online. The other thing that I saw was this need to always be on, to always be tethered to technology. And again, it was our conduit for learning, it was our conduit for leisure, and it was our conduit for connection with family and friends. We've also seen a change in our preference for short-form communication. We're seeing this in organizations with Teams chats and Slack dominating as opposed to emails or a phone call or a quick conversation. So I think there's some of the trends. The other thing that I think we started to see was that we started to use technology in ways that was completely incongruent with how we are designed as humans, what I refer to as our HOS, our human operating system. And so we were multitasking, we were working for long stretches of time without a break, we were being constantly bombarded with notifications and alerts, which stress our brain. We had a very narrow gaze and looking at a very small surface area, as we do when we look at a phone or a laptop or a tablet, triggers the stress response in our brain. So all of these ways of working, particularly with the preponderance of digital screens, mean that we're working out of alignment with how we are designed as humans.
Okay. And so in your book, you also talk about this term ousted. Won't you just expand on that then?
So I think our tech habits, again, professionally and personally as adults, have led to many of us feeling ousted, which I described as being overwhelmed, under the pump, stressed, time poor, exhausted, and distracted. And because we're using our devices in ways that aren't congruent with how we are designed as humans, this is why we feel like we're constantly stressed and overwhelmed. I mean, today you ask anyone how they are, and most people respond with one of the two Bs, busy or burnt out. And I believe that is a symptom of us. And again, I want to point out, I fully acknowledge that we have been through a global pandemic, which presents unique psychological challenges for all of us, or many of us. I also want to acknowledge that we're in a time of economic uncertainty. So again, there are some other extraneous variables that we need to consider. But I think in part, one of the reasons that so many of us feel like stressed and distracted constantly, or the busy and burnt out phenomenon that we're hearing, is because we are using technology. And again, it's happened very quickly in a human lifespan kind of perspective, and it's happened without the opportunity for us to pause and reflect. And so we're using devices in ways that mismatch how we are designed as humans, what I sometimes say is our biological blueprint. And that's why I think we're seeing stress, exhaustion, and distraction rates through the roof.
So I'd love to get a bit more practical then. You talk a lot in your book about some of the micro stresses that we face. You kind of drill down into some of these areas more specifically. And then you also give these beautiful recommendations for buffers and micro habits to counter the micro stresses. Just give us some of your, obviously you can't explain your whole book in this podcast, but just give us some of those so we get an idea of what that looks like.
Sure. So the reason I think we are ousted is because there's a collision of two things. One, we've introduced a whole lot of little micro stresses into our days. Now, on their own, these things would be quite harmless. I'm talking here about alerts and notifications. The adolescent and the adult brain cannot differentiate between a TikTok notification and a tiger chasing us. They both come to us, and we have brains that are designed to go and forage and get and hunt and seek for information. We're not designed to have information constantly thrust at us. So constant alerts and notifications, having, as I mentioned before, that very narrow gaze. Multitasking releases cortisol in our brain. It literally is a stressor. We also know that we send information. We don't store information in the brain's hippocampus, which is the memory center when we multitask. It bypasses our hippocampus and we end up activating our striatum, and that won't help us with long-term retrieval. So all of these little things are happening at a relatively short period of time. We're also sitting for long stretches and working without having adequate breaks. So we've had these little accumulation of micro stresses. The second part of the equation that I think is why we're ousted is because we have, as you identified, eroded some of the biological buffers that used to help us manage our stress and help us be focused and alert. We know we're not getting good quality and quantity of sleep. We're more sedentary than we've ever been. We're not getting enough sunlight. I've done a student digital wellbeing assessment, and we know that adolescents, the government guidelines or recommendations, eye health recommendations for natural sunlight exposure is around 90 minutes per day. So 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Overwhelmingly, many adolescents in our study are not getting adequate amounts of sunlight. They're not getting anywhere close to that 90 minutes per day. Now, that sunlight exposure is critical for resetting their circadian rhythms, particularly in the early morning hours. We also know sunlight exposure has been scientifically proven to reduce the onset or reduce the likelihood of the onset of myopia, which is nearsightedness. And so there's so many cumulative effects that can happen because of this.
One of the reasons we struggle with attention in this modern age is because multitasking is seen as a virtue. We're told we should be able to do it all, even though there aren't even enough hours in the day. In my seminars, I talk about the myth of multitasking. When I talk about multitasking, I don't mean walking and chewing gum at the same time. We do that on autopilot because it doesn't require thinking about. That's more muscle memory. But we can't process two different types of information at the same time. That's called split tasking, not multitasking. If you're typing an email to your boss while actively having a conversation with your teen, you are just doing both things poorly. At the same time, having constant notifications or interruptions also cause you stress. Kristy talks with us about how we can add some healthy micro habits into our lives. These are helpful for us as adults, which I think we need to try to model first and then teach them to our teens.
So some of the things, really pragmatic things that I say to counter this is turn off non-essential notifications. If they are going to stress the brain, which they do, disable the non-essential. The other thing I encourage young people and adults to do is to bundle or batch your notifications so that they're not dribbling in throughout the day. Choose the time. Is it on the bus on the way home? Is it after you've done all of your homework and your assessments in the evening? For me as a parent, I just cannot deal with the constant barrage of WhatsApp notifications for my kids' sport and school groups. I've chosen to get them all at 8 o'clock at night when I'm in a headspace to deal with it. And then create VIP notifications. So when you do put your phone on focus or do not disturb mode, everybody gets blocked apart from those people on that particular list. We have to start teaching, I think, that the super skill of the 21st century for everybody, not our IQ, not our EQ. The most important skill of the 21st century is our FQ, our focus quotient. So we have to explicitly teach young people how to focus. And I know that seems really rudimentary to adults, but teaching them to monotask rather than multitask, putting their phone somewhere where they cannot see it while they're doing their study or their important revision. Because research tells us time and time again, even if the phone is on silent and face down, just seeing it impairs our cognitive performance. Teaching young people we're not designed to work in marathons. Our brain has never been designed to work for long periods. We are designed to work in sprints, not marathons. So to study and then have a break. And by break, I don't mean checking TikTok or Snapchat. A break is doing something restorative. Getting them practicing dilating their gaze, looking at things in the distance to help with that stress response and also with that digital eye strain. Even simple things like how we breathe has been changed. We know that as humans, we should sigh roughly every 5 minutes. Now, teenagers are pretty good at the melodramatic sigh. It's very obvious when they're sighing. I'm not talking about the hand on the hip and the exasperated sigh. All of us should be sighing roughly every 5 minutes to regulate our oxygen and carbon dioxide levels and again, bring us back to that baseline. But we know when we're on our screens, our sigh rate falls off the cliff. What does this tell us? We're in this heightened stressed state, coupled with the fact that when we have a very narrow gaze, when we're looking at our phone or our tablet, it sends a message to our brain, we are stressed. Because humans, we're designed to look out in the distance and dilate our gaze, but we're spending hours in this stress state. So again, encouraging young people to intentionally sigh, and they really like this one. They mastered this skill quite quickly. Really simple breathing practices and, taking a break and looking at things in the distance. So they're really not complicated things because I don't think as humans we are that complicated. It's just coming back to what do we need as humans to thrive?
Yeah. And I think that's why I love your book so much, because when I picked it up and I read it, and the things I've heard you say leading up to the release of your book were very practical and very doable. So it's not something that I feel as a parent is another burden, another big thing I've got to do. It's easy for me, and it's easy for me to help my teenager who's still at home think about those things. So I love how you've brought those real practical, easy steps that we can just do while we're sitting on the bus or getting up from somewhere. They're just such doable things. So thank you for that, Kristy. So finally, I always ask my guests this very last question. What is your hope for this generation of young people for your topic, this digitally saturated world?
Oh, thank you for your kind words. My biggest mission writing the book was that it would be practical, because I think so many of us lament this situation, and telling us that it's a problem isn't really going to do anything for any of us. And why I love the work that I do is that we have to have tangible, realistic strategies. My mission is that they will do better than what we are as adults. I want young people to use technology. I think it has so many merits and rich opportunities. It allows us to learn in new ways. It allows us to connect and create things that were never, ever an option. But I think the real opportunity is that we want to empower young people to take back control of technology rather than it controlling them. And I think we have a generation of empowered young people who don't want to be a slave to their screen. And I think it's talking to them about how they can go about doing this. Because, as I mentioned, we don't get this time back. And the tech that they use has been manipulated to take away their time and their attention. And so I want our young people to reverse that trend, and I want them to use it, but use it in healthy and helpful ways.
I really appreciate how practical Kristy's advice is. These micro habits don't feel overwhelming, and they are things we can put into our lives day to day. If you would like to know more about Dr. Kristy's work, you can find her at drkristygoodwin.com. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.